Hey everyone, Pastor George here. Welcome to this episode of A New Thing, and I'm excited to be here with all of you. So, today is going to be an episode on relationships, or really what the Bible has to tell us about relationships. I mean, that's even not a great example. I think it's better to just show you. So, I'm just going to show you. All right, give me a second here to pull this up. So, there's a reason that I want to talk about this. Um, and the reason I want to talk about it is because it's become. I saw this article pop up on my ground news for today. Let me just make it bigger for you. There it is. So, as you can see, it says Game of Thrones AI chatbot linked to teen suicide sparks legal battle. Um, and it basically, I mean, I'm not going to go too deep into the article, but essentially what happened is this 14-year-old kid got addicted to this AI chatbot, and he was interacting with it, and this is like a chatbot that is for relationships, or he ended up forming like a romantic relationship with it, if you want to call it that, and and something, it ended up very negatively affecting his life, and eventually it led to his sad and tragic death by suicide. So, not great, but it made me think kind of deeply about like what leads to things like this. And I think our culture has a serious relationship problem right now, or how we view romantic relationships, because we kind of feed ourselves two separate teachings. And those teachings are, right, like you can be a complete and whole person without having to be in a relationship. In fact, relationships, as we talked about last week with like 2 weeks ago or whatever it was, we talked about polygamy. Um, and we and like the idea that monogamy itself is a bad thing, right? So that's even the idea that relationships can be suffocating and you're supposed to be independent and free or whatever, or they could be costly, right? Actually, the idea of independence and freedom is more sold to women in our culture. The idea that relationships are costly is like why a lot of young men are kind of turned off of relationships, by influencers and things like that. So that's the one thing we say. But on the other hand, like, you're expected to be in a relationship after a certain point and to get married and all these other things, right? So even among people who say that sort of thing, you'll never see people. I rarely see anyone who is uh, who is single, and they'll proudly post how single they are, but then also complain about the dating scene and things like that, right? So, and I think this leads to a lot of confusion on the part of people in our culture when it comes to how do we view relationships, how do we view um, the idea of romantic entanglement. And you'll remember that when I preached on sexuality a few years ago, I actually started by talking about singleness, and that's actually what I'm going to do today, because we never talk about it. If we do talk about singleness, it is usually in the context of something you don't want to be, or kind of being, even in the sense, overly proud of it, um, but not in a biblical way, right? Like this idea that, oh, I'm independent or whatever, and I don't have to worry about it. It's like that's not the biblical view of singleness either. And this really just comes down to how do we view these types of relationships. One of the things I want to point out, though, is this made me think of two other things. So, just the other ways our culture has interacted with this, and then we're going to look at our Bible passage, like two movies that I've seen that I think are interesting to think about. So the first is Her, which is pretty much this situation as a movie. So, this is a movie. I'm not going to spoil everything for you, but this is a movie where Joaquin Phoenix plays this guy who falls in love with an AI, and kind of the uh, journey that is for him, and what ends up happening, in response to that sort of thing. So it's a good movie. Both of the movies I'm going to talk about today are artsy, on the artsier side. This is definitely the more accessible one than the one I'm going to talk about next. But of course, this movie has a lot to say about what constitutes a relationship, what does it mean to be in love with something that's not real, right? Like this, um, you know, it's interesting. And the second is The Lobster. The Lobster more focuses its attack on the idea that you have to be in a relationship. Obviously, you can tell it's a very strange name for the movie. It's by director Yorgos Lanthimos, who usually does a lot of more uh, avant-garde type of stuff. I will say, like, the ideas of this movie I found very interesting. Although watching it, I didn't like that much. I think Yorgos Lanthimos's best movie is The Favorite. But in any case, The Lobster has an interesting point to kind of make because it's all about this guy who goes to a resort, and at this resort, you have to you have to find someone to be in a relationship with by the end of a certain point, and if you don't find the person by the end of a certain point, you're turned into an animal of your choice. And so he chooses a lobster. I can't remember why. He does give a funny explanation for it, but that's why it's called The Lobster, in case you wanted to know, because it's a very odd title, right? And basically, the whole point of the movie is like couples trying desperately to find someone else to be with, but before the end of this time, before they're turned into animals, and kind of the odd um, stuff that people will go through or change their personality or things like that. Right? It's commentary on relationships and how that affects people. So I actually liked a lot of that. It just presented in a very jarring and avant-garde way, which I I found too much for my personal taste. Just too weird for me. But that's all right. Whatever. People are into different things. But this is a good movie, and this is a good movie, and both of them hint at our culture, at least Western cultures, right? Idea of what constitutes relationship, what constitutes um, positive things, negative things, and it both attack or both are talking about this idea of desire to be in a relationship and to have a spouse or to have a boyfriend or to have a girlfriend or whatever, right? This idea that we have to do these types of things, or the only way we're going to feel complete is if we have that in our life. And so I want to start with this because, like, if we want to know what leads people to do this, right, especially among the young, of course, I'm sure we don't know all the facts. The mom is suing this AI chatbot company. I don't really have any interest in talking about that. We don't have all the facts. It's very possible this young man was suffering from mental problems, but even if you take this as an extreme example, right, it's not hard to see kind of the ripples, the smaller ripples of our kind of misunderstood view of relationships in the culture generally, when it comes to marriages, when it comes to view of relationship and things like that. So I wanted to look at these two passages from the Bible just to kind of frame this and talk about it. So the first is 1 Corinthians 7, 8 through 9. I actually make, when I do marriage premarital counseling, I actually make the couples read 1 Corinthians 7 because I actually think it's really important because it's Paul's instructions on marriage, but it also has this interesting part where it talks about being unmarried and actually how Paul has uh, a preference for one over the other, right? So this is says down to the unmarried and the widows, I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I do. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion, right? So Paul here has a preference for people being unmarried, and he goes in to talk about other things or make references to this in other places. But the general idea here is that you're burdened when you're married or when you have children, and so it's easier to work for the gospel and to follow God when you're unmarried. Um, and that's his argument, right? He doesn't disparage marriage because that's oftentimes what will happen, right? In the reverse, is uh, we're people who are told to be obsessed with getting married or finding a spouse will sometimes flip and just say, "Oh, the whole thing's messed up." Paul is not reacting to this. He's simply kind of stating kind of a biblical principle about following God, right? And putting him in front of other things. Now, um, one of the important thing is if we go down, right, to my next passage, you'll see this again talked about. So this is Jesus talking with Pharisees about divorce, and we're not going to focus too much on Jesus' teaching about divorce, even though that's important. What we're mostly going to focus on is what Jesus says at the end, and what his disciples say, because this kind of hints at the overall point of what Jesus is going to say. So Jesus is teaching, and it says, when Jesus had finished saying these things, he left Galilee and went to the region of Judea, the other side of the Jordan. Large crowd followed him, and he healed them there. Some Pharisees came to test him. They asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? So at the time of Jesus, just to give some context, there was this teaching. Basically, there was general teaching that said divorce is fine basically whenever. Kind of there were two schools of rabbinic thought, and then there was also no, you can never do it, right? So those are the kind of two. So the Pharisees are in here, and they basically ask him, is it all right to divorce for any reason? And Jesus says, haven't you read that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another man commits adultery. So this is important for just showing that God makes allowances for human faults, right? He does this in the law of Moses, but in Jesus, right, it's a return. We should be returning our thoughts to the way things were at the beginning. This is actually pretty important when we think about maybe some other topics that we see in the Bible, like slavery, for instance, right? Like Moses permitted that, but there's this idea in the Christian faith that there's this return back to the way it was in the beginning before those things were placed, and so we would be returning, right? So there's a lot of this in the New Testament. But the disciples said to him, if this situation, so this is the Jesus' disciples. They say, if this is the situation between a husband and a wife, it is better not to marry. So it's really interesting, right? Is Jesus has this very high standard, and his disciples go, oh, it's better not to marry in this case, right? And Jesus says this, he says, not everyone can accept this word, but only to those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who are born that way, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it. So it's really interesting is they say it's better not to marry at all. And you would expect maybe Jesus to say, no, it's good to marry, it's better to marry. But he actually says, not everyone can accept this. So you have this interesting tension in Christianity, right? Where we definitely, especially in different denominations, different cultures, different traditions, struggle with this in different ways. So on the one hand, right, you have, like, generally in Protestantism, you have a really struggle with this idea that people can be single. You see this in lots of Protestant churches and in culture where it really prioritizes marriage. For instance, like pastors are allowed to marry in Protestant churches, right? Where they're not allowed to marry in the Catholic Church, for instance, right? So, you have like this idea that you have to be married, and that becomes a pretty standard thing in a lot of Protestant cultures and countries. On the flip side, you have in the Catholic Church, you kind of have the opposite, where they accept and actually are better, I think, at grappling with the idea that people who are going to devote themselves to Christ in the fullest way possible are not going to be married, right? Because that means living like Jesus did. Jesus didn't have a wife. He wasn't married, right? He lived celibately. So that's kind of the goal for the Christian life. And you have that obviously in priests and in monks and nuns and things like that, right? So it's available there. But the problem is then it takes on a spiritual superiority dimension, which is absolutely absent from the text, right? So and it ends up that these people are more holy than other people because they're single, and that's not what the text says at all, right? Paul's whole point and Jesus's point here is that you do this for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And I actually think that this can be threaded really well And if we as Christians can figure out a way to present this in a life giving manner, the idea that you get to serve the Lord, right? If you're single, that's fine. If you're married, that's also fine. But like you're not going to be, your worth is not dictated by your relationship with other people. And so often, even when we say it's not, it is, right? We can say, we could say, oh, it doesn't matter. But if you are one of the people that consistently pesters one of your children to get married, it does matter to you, right? Or if you're one of the people that say, "Oh, it doesn't matter if I am single," I'm happy and proud that I'm single, and you post resentful things online, uh, or you turn to AI chatbots to fill that that relationship hole, then it does matter to you, right? So oftentimes say things don't matter to us, but they actually do. And I think just being honest with ourselves is really the best place to start. And I think just understanding that we can have desires and we have to live through those tensions, but we should desire to serve Christ first and above all things. So that's just my short episode today. I just saw that pop up on my news, so I wanted to talk about it. Next week is going to be a movie review, which I am excited for. So I will see you guys next week. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Thursday. Peace out.